Hi everyone, my name is Shannon Gibney. I am a writer as well as a educator, professor based in Minneapolis. Um, I teach writing to students at Minneapolis College, which is a 2-year urban community college in downtown Minneapolis, and we serve the most diverse and most vulnerable students in the state of Minnesota. At any given time, probably 11% of our student body is either hungry or homeless. Um, and that obviously causes a lot of challenges for us in terms of students being able to get their coursework done. But it also is just brings an amazing amount of vibrancy and storytelling and connections into the classroom as well, which is why I have loved teaching there for so long. Yeah, and I also write books across genres. So this is my most recent book. It's called The Girl I Am, Was, and Never Will Be. And the subtitle is A Speculative Memoir of Transracial Adoption. And so I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about the power of those liminal spaces that so many of our students and so many of us also inhabit. I identify as mixed Black, half white. My children are Black, but they are bicultural. They're Liberian and African American. I've written about that. I continue to write about that, but I think that although there are a lot of challenges sort of that can come into play in the classroom and beyond, when students and others have identities that are maybe not legible immediately to maybe folks in more dominant categories, there's also plenty of space for additional connections. So I am going to talk about how insisting on the in-between in telling stories and sharing stories for and about young people is not only a formidable act of resistance, but a necessary one, particularly in the current moment when our politics and cultures are so polarized and fragmented. So as James Baldwin, who's one of my favorite authors, famously said, people evolve a language in order to describe and thus control their circumstances, or in order to not be submerged by a reality they cannot articulate. And so I would argue that that's what we're doing when we, along with our students, insist on occupying this in-between space in telling stories for young people. A Washington Post article published in 2021 was called "We're Talking About a Big, Powerful Phenomenon," end quote, multiracial Americans drive change. And from that article, it said that more than 33 million Americans, that's about 1 in 10, identify as being of 2 or more races, a number that grew by nearly 25 million people in the past decade, according to the 2020 census. And that's really interesting for me to hear because, again, as a mixed race, multiracial person, that was certainly not the case when I was growing up and a student myself. But I definitely see that reflected in my classes. Also in the article, this demographer, Richard Alba, who's a professor of sociology at the City University of New York, says, the mixing of all sorts of races is really a new force in 21st century America. He adds, we're talking about a big, powerful phenomenon. Yeah, so as I said before, I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan in the 80s and 90s, and at that time I was just one of a handful of mixed kids in my classes. There certainly wasn't much language to describe that identity at that time, or really even much acknowledgement that it was an identity at all. And then, if we fast forward 30 to 40 years, and mixed race identity and experience is exploding in communities across the country, not just in terms of Black and white either. And if the lived experience is becoming predominant, the language has to accommodate and represent it somehow. Remember the Baldwin quote. Particularly for young people who need to see themselves reflected in the culture around them in order to develop a solid sense of self. Years ago, when I was sending out my first book, Scene of Color, to potential editors and publishers, a common response I got from the mostly white editors who read it was, this was maddening to me, you can write a novel, a YA novel about transracial adoption, you can write one about gender roles in families, you can write a book about baseball, you can write one about mixed race identity, but you can't write a YA novel about all of this at once. So as you can imagine, that made my head blow off because, of course, my response to this was, welcome to my world. I actually inhabit all those experiences and identities in real life, just like many, many of our students do. But it's interesting when I think about it now in 2023, because I actually don't think that editors and publishers would have the same response now, 15 years later, given all these demographic shifts I've been highlighting. And then along with that, the plethora of YA middle grade children's picture books that this has ushered in. I mean, at least I hope that's the case. So experience itself opens up space for the art, and the art helps recognize and validate the experience. And so the art itself, I also want to be clear, is not just the published work. People often ask me when I myself, became a writer or started writing, and I have to go back. I tell the story often of being a first grader in 1982, Ann Arbor, Michigan, and writing my first magnum opus, which was a book about strawberry shortcake, and that won the first grade award for best book in my little elementary school, public school, fully funded public school, back when that was a thing, in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And so I think as teachers, we can see the generative power of making sure that our students also understand that these stories that they have to tell about existing in the in-betweens are just as important as the published ones. And going back to my notes here. So in many ways, I feel like that first novel of mine has sort of entered the realm of the normal now. What is it, 8 years later? It's been out for 8 years. And just because culturally we're in this different space, which is exciting. And also with these like liminal identities that our students are inhabiting, we can also talk about trans youth, non-binary youth, youth that are challenging the received choices for gender identities, but so many books on this topic are now being banned, right? And especially if those books are also about folks from racially marginalized communities. And so then it becomes even more important for us as teachers to talk about students' experiences, our own experiences, use these books, and particularly the ones that are being challenged. I think one of the most challenged books is All Boys Aren't Blue, whose author George Johnson identifies as Black, non-binary, and queer. Also, A Queer History of the United States for Young People and Genderqueer are some of the other highly contested books for young people. that have been challenged. So when you challenge assumed hierarchies just by existing, you know you're in the generative space of the in-between. It's a dangerous, often exhausting place to be. None of us want to be there when we are there. None of our students certainly want to be there. None of us feels it is a gift or a window into creativity or an opportunity to explode existing regressive binaries. More often we just feel trapped and scared. But I'm arguing here for a third approach, that we can transform these cages of domination by insisting on and continuing to insist that our students tell their stories and our stories in this place. Even if it might be bruised or misunderstood, as Audre Lorde would say, even if it is challenged and we risk censorship and our students risk being censored, the space created by the storytelling is a formidable push, one that demands recognition. Even if we don't win every political battle for safety and equal citizenry and respect, telling these stories and creating the conditions in which our students can tell these stories has its own intrinsic value, and it's called freedom.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Christina Easton. I am the program manager at adoptaclassroom.org, and I am happy to be here with several of our members of the Teacher Advisory Board. I will have them introduce themselves and what they do, starting with Annie Alcott.
Hi, everybody. I'm Annie Alcott. I'm coming to you from Berkeley, California. I play a couple of roles at adoptaclassroom.org. I am on the Teacher Advisory Board, as Christina mentioned, and I also serve on the Board of Directors. I have been a public school educator for 30 years and kind of done two different things, worked in the elementary classroom and also in teacher education. And right now that's the hat that I'm wearing, is teacher education.
Hello, everyone. My name is Felicia Henderson. I am coming from New Jersey, and I am a first grade teacher. Love, love, love it. If you can only imagine some incredible, energetic students. I have been teaching for 16 years now and loving every minute of it. I am also a social justice coordinator and the BIPOC leadership chairperson at my school in New Jersey. And I'm super proud to be a part of adoptaclassroom.org and the Teacher Advisory Board.
I should also shout out that Felicia Henderson is one of our most recent teacher leader grant winners, which is a new program here at Adopt a Classroom. Felicia won for sharing her practices in racial equity in schools, and specifically in an activity about building student confidence that we hope many of our teachers will be able to get from our site now and use in their classrooms and spread the amazing talents that these educators on our Teacher Advisory Board have. So with that, let's get into our talk about Shannon Gibney's presentation here. What stands out to you all as educators about what she shared?
Something that stand out with Shannon's presentation was about having that in-between stage. I think many of us have that in-between. With our identity, it's so complex. It's layered upon layers of who we are and becoming who we want to be. And we have to notice that as educators, that our students are dealing with that as well. And us as educators, we have to be able to create that space so where they can explore who they are and who they are becoming. So I love that she was able to share her own experience, but also highlighting how important it is for us to make sure that we are allowing our students to be themselves and explore every bit of who they are, really the whole child.
I had a lot of the same reaction, that sort of interstitial zone, that space in between, I think is so powerful. And as a teacher, it kind of makes me feel like there are a couple of responsibilities that we have. One is to look at ourselves in the classroom and the role that we play. You know, who am I? Where do I come from? What are my experiences? What are my biases? How am I going to, what do I bring into the classroom? But then also, you know, the real joy for me always came with getting to know my students and my families deeply. And, you know, it involves asking a lot of questions and really thinking, like what Felicia just said, about the whole child, about their culture, their language, their gender identity, their race, anything that the family brings to the classroom. And that's really powerful. And figuring out, not just like she talked about storytelling and having kids do storytelling, but not just letting them do storytelling, but guiding them in doing that storytelling. How do you tell that story? How do you look at yourself? And then the other big thing that struck me was that she talked a lot about books and her own books that have been banned, wonderful literature that's out there. And as someone who teaches reading to teacher candidates, I think a lot about the role of literacy and the need for rich, comprehensive, nuanced approach to literacy, to reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and all the materials that come with that.
Yeah, I throughout her talk, and perhaps it's my not only former educator, but specifically former school principal hat that came on, my mind immediately went to time, resources. She really, what struck me was the way that she described the importance of storytelling really was about making time and like you said, allowing students to have the room not only to explore their identities and see their own stories, but also share and tell and connect through their own stories, right? And that's a huge call to action, right? I mean, that's a task. So I wanted to ask you both as educators and, in your classrooms and in your experiences, what are some of the challenges that you face around creating that time and space for students to tell their stories? Or for you even, Annie, to your point.
The demands of standardized curriculum and very sort of curriculum that we have to implement in these very specific ways. And sometimes you have academic freedom to interpret and to meet the needs of your students, and sometimes you don't. And that's can be a real challenge. And it does require academic freedom to create the spaces where kids can feel the safety, feel the bravery, feel the community to be who they are, to learn to express who they are. And, as a teacher, that's really worth fighting for.
I think that some of the challenges that educators face can be abiding by school criteria and curriculum. Also, finding the time to make that a priority, to make a space where students feel comfortable with being themselves and telling their stories. Oftentimes, schools may encourage educators like, okay, we're doing social emotional learning, but don't really give us the time to do these things because we have all this other academic, the math, the science, all the other major and important things to do too, but not really giving us the time to set aside to make this a priority as well. Just as important as the academics. Social emotional learning is really, really important. Students need to be able to feel comfortable about who they are in order for them to be able to interact with others, right? In order for them to learn empathy and engage with others in respectful manners, they need this teachings. But we don't always have that as a priority in our schools, right? So we're always struggling. It's like pulling teeth, trying to find the time to do these things. But sometimes when you are carving time out to do the social emotional learning because you know how important it is, sometimes you have to maybe miss a day of math. Sometimes you have to miss a day of social studies. And overall, you're still making sure that your students get what they need.
Felicia, I'm so glad you brought up social emotional learning. That Adopt a Classroom has been really hearing from teachers that this is one of the greatest challenges is not only making time, but having the tools to really implement social emotional learning well and address student wellness. And that's why we just kind of shifted from our COVID fund for grants for teachers to social emotional wellness. And for me, so I used to work in a high school setting. So when I listened to you, Felicia, talk about like, oh, maybe you might need to miss a day of math, the structure for older students is completely different, right? And so social emotional learning and wellness in the classroom really is in every subject, because I think sometimes we think about it as, teaching social skills, but it's really about, when you think about what it's defined as by mental health and clinical folks, it's about decision making, right? It's about listening to understand, which is not only a social skill, but an academic skill, you know? And so when I hear Shannon talking about storytelling, there's room for that in a lot of places. And I know a lot of educators who are really creative and find ways to do that. But it can be a real challenge when you are spinning your wheels trying to force it in or find the material. And that brings me to, you know, Anna, you mentioned the book banning that she referred to, and the basic struggle to find and have access to materials that build an environment of equity and understanding. And so I guess my next question for you all is, you know, what experiences do you have in terms of finding the tools, right, to meet this call to action that we're hearing from people like Shannon?
You know, it makes me think, one thing that I realized over the years is that you kind of have to I had to flip the narrative in my own head. Like, it's not just about the math. It's not about the science. It's not about literacy. In order to learn those very critical things, you have to start with the child. If the child is anxious, if the child is hungry, if the child is not feeling like they can express themselves in the classroom for whatever cultural reasons, gender reasons, language reasons, all those different things that kids, of course, we all bring to classrooms, that has to get addressed first in order to create that access to the learning. So I think it sometimes gets framed as an either or. And I think that by the misunderstanding of what social emotional learning is. So I think that that's something that we have to really push on as educators. And I think that for me, when I was receiving funding from Adopt a Classroom as a teacher, I spent a lot of my funds on materials that my district just didn't provide. And a lot of that was books. But it was also, you know, it was also art materials, ways in which kids could express themselves, ways in which families could participate from home without necessarily having to come to the classroom, but also coming into the classroom, having events, all those kinds of things. But the books for me really opened a window to identity for all of us.
I think teachers definitely need to think outside the box. Considering the beginning of the year, you probably get a budget. If you're lucky, you have a budget. And your budget, let's say, is $500, if you're lucky, right? Because not all of us get that $500 budget. And now you have $500 budget, but you have 22 to 30 students. Already doesn't sound fair, right? But with that, you really are only scratching the surface. You're getting only the bare essentials, and that's your papers, your pencils. Don't forget that pencil sharpener, because all those pencils are going to break. You need a new stapler, but it doesn't really do anything for really meeting the students where they are. Yes, it gives you your essentials, your paper and stuff like that. But how about, your arts and crafts? How about giving a space where your students can express themselves? Maybe you have students who love music, and not all schools offer music classes and things like that, those electives. So you want to try your best to try to have all these things in your classroom, because you have all these different types of learners, right? You have your visual learners, you have your students who auditory, you have all these students who have different amazing, beautiful minds, but you want to reach each and every one of those, but you don't always have the material to meet their needs. And you have to think outside the box. And that's where Adopt a Classroom, where you can do your crowdfunding and share it on social media and get all these amazing people to see your classroom page and all these things like that. That allows you to bring some income into your classroom, so then you can meet the needs of your students. So that's why I love Adopt a Classroom, because I get to do things with my students that I don't necessarily have the opportunity to do if I didn't have Adopt a Classroom, because my budget is so, it's not that it's so low, it's just that it just doesn't match my students' needs.
Yeah.
So being able to get the extra funds is amazing.
And Felicia, I got to say, you are the expert about your kids, about your classroom. And, one thing that I value so highly about Adopt a Classroom is that that's exactly what it's about. Recognizing you as the expert in your classroom, and what do your kids need? What do your families need? What do you need in order to accomplish all of the things that you want to do, including, making sure that all those kids are seen and their stories get told, and having that flexibility.
Yeah, the flexibility and the equity and the access, right? Like that's, again, from Shannon's talk when she referenced the Baldwin quote about, creating language in order to not only understand, but have some control of the world around you. I think that unless you've been in a classroom with those 20 kids who all learn differently and have such different stories, it's very easy to take for granted that as long as you care about the kids and give them all the same material and the same level of effort, they're going to get something out of your teaching, right? And that quote to me really speaks to the issue of equity around, it's not just about making sure everybody has the same stuff, right? It's about making sure that everybody has what they as an individual need. And if that means that, coming back to the idea of each of our students having layered identities, right? It's not enough to just say oh, we did Black History Month, so all of my, Black and brown kids have seen themselves. Cool, check. Oh, we celebrated Lunar New Year and learned a little bit about that, and we did a little activity. Everybody's seen themselves, right? It's not that simple. It's really about creating space to explore, and that requires a whole lot more than a book or two or a lesson. That is about creating an environment. That's what really, really struck me as I thought about the work that we do and how we can respond to the issues that she brought up. It's that richness of environment and that access and meeting, Felicia, exactly the way you said, every one of those 20 kids where they are and what they need, not just making sure everybody has the same pencils, right? So much more.
Something that I really admire about what Shannon was talking about was initially, as soon as she started talking, she's like, I am Black and I am white, right? And I found that to be so powerful because her being able to identify who she is, I'm so sure that helps her to connect with her students, because we live in a world where, pure blood is not a thing. We are all mixed with something, somehow, somewhere, and allowing our students to have to be able to relate to their educator. When an educator can be so open to share those things with their students become comfortable and learning to know who they are and ready to explore who they are. They have their questions and they're not afraid to ask questions and explore all the new things about who they are becoming. So I really admired that when she just letting us know right off the bat who she is. And I connect with that as well. I mean, me being Black and Puerto Rican, or how everyone says now, Afro-Latina, but me being able to accept who I am, accept my identity, but also knowing that I am also in that land of in between, because you have that where she's not Black enough or she's not Latina enough. And I know that even though I work with first graders, I see my middle schoolers in the hallway and I hear them conversing with each other. And I know that they are battling with that same in between notion, So being able to make sure that educators can have that connection with their students, and knowing that your identity and their identity, there is some kind of interconnection there. There's something there that's going to allow them to become more open and free to speak and share their thoughts and ask their questions and just be their amazing selves.
And that's how we learn, right?
Absolutely. To me, it's, what you're talking about, Felicia, and also what Shannon was talking about, it's taking the time, making the space to have a relationship with your students, with your families, and also guiding them to have that relationship with their peers, with one another. You're gonna come and go and through the years, and they're gonna be with their peers and with their families. And so how do we teach kids how to communicate? How do we get kids to solve conflicts. Conflicts are part of human life, but how do we do that in a way that's constructive? How do we do that in a way that's respectful? And it's messy. It's not always easy, but having, good, solid social emotional curriculum is really important. Having models and bringing families into your classroom in so many ways is also really, really critical. But
Annie, I love that you said that it's messy, because it is. It isn't always a comfortable space. It's not. And that leads to another opposition that you may come across, where you have, whether it's school issues, or you have other staff, or you have parents who are not always comfortable with the kinds of conversations that are happening in the classroom, which are all very truthful, and they're student oriented, because students are bringing these topics up. So it's not like teachers are just like, hey, let me throw this monkey wrench into this conversation and let's talk about this today. No, a lot of the conversations that we're having is because our students are bringing it into the classroom, and it relates to who they are. It relates to all the amazing and incredible things that they're seeing around the world that's just changing and evolving. And us as educators, we want to welcome those conversations. So sometimes those conversations make parents uncomfortable. Sometimes it makes officials uncomfortable, but we have to understand that we have to create a space where we can have these conversations, create open minds, and be ready to share how we feel, but also respectful, right? Just because we have difference of opinions doesn't mean that we need to be fighting one another. No, we should be able to hear one another, hear each other out, and talk about our differences.
And it's so interesting that you talk about the discomfort, because the other thing that stood out to me from what Shannon was talking about towards the end of her talk, when she was saying, most of the time, this is not these in-between spaces of our identities is not a place we ask to be or are excited about being. This is a reality that can sometimes be challenging and scary. And so all the more reason, right? If you're uncomfortable with the conversation, imagine the discomfort of the experience that the person is having, right? Living in this space. And so what I love about the points that both of you have brought up is that I'm sitting here thinking, like, long game, right? Our students are going to be adults who are going to be grappling with these same issues. And we want to set them up to be confident, to understand themselves, to understand each other. And this is a lot about of what that work is. I guess I'll close by asking each of you, and I know, Annie, that you are working with educators in training, so maybe think about them as I ask you this question. After listening to Shannon's address, what is something that you want to not necessarily do differently, but remember in your practice moving forward, or that you would want others who listen to this talk to think about in their practice moving forward?
For me, one thing that just looking at who Shannon is in her own teaching and herself as a writer, that point about writing being transformative was really struck a chord with me. And I think that, there are always controversies in teaching literacy. Those of us who've been around, it goes back and it goes forward, then it goes back and it goes forward. And sometimes I think writing can get pushed to the wayside, or we need to be able to do informational writing. And yes, very important. And we need to make that space for kids to tell their stories. And you can't just snap your fingers and say, oh, tell your story. No, you have to create the environment where kids feel safe. You have to create the peer relationships where that's comfortable. You have to teach them a lot of things about writing in order for them to take up that pencil or that keyboard and write those stories. And so making space for writing in not just the day-to-day, but the longitudinal way as a really important tool for telling stories.
I would say moving forward, after listening to Shannon speak and connecting it to how I teach in the classroom, I think the most memorable thing is to not be afraid to have conversations with our students and, let it flow. let it flow. Sometimes it goes beyond the point of what you started talking about because they all have different experiences, right? So be open to hearing them out, hear what they're saying, and then you'll see how things start to really connect. Eventually, you'll get back to the original topic because then someone else adds their experience and their own little experience and their own little experiences. And take away from that your students are really comfortable enough to share that with you. Right. So, and the really amazing part of all of that is when it's weeks down the line and you're teaching something totally different, and students are able to go back to that conversation that you had weeks before and go, hey, Miss Anderson, I remember when we talked about this, right? Like those are those moments. Those are those moments when you're like, hey, I am doing something good in my classroom. They remember what I taught them. They remember that conversation. So like that is like the biggest takeaway for me. Like when children can just go back to a conversation or a teaching from before, and it's like, wow, okay, we're making a difference. We're doing something that they are really like something that's really installing in their brain, and they're remembering and they're holding on to. So like that's my biggest takeaway.
That really makes me think of like, I'm going to put my elementary school teacher hat back on. My last few years I did kindergarten, and I'd come from upper grades and I was teaching with a team, and I was pretty used to talking about identity, and I would use words like racism and gender and binary, and just words that were really important in helping kids with that identity process. And at first some of the other kindergarten teachers were like, can you say that with them? Like, yeah,
yes,
you got to. And the other thing that I'm going to say is remembering to then capture those conversations that you're talking about, Felicia, and let families know, oh my gosh, I asked this question today, and guess what? It went way over here, and we had this fascinating conversation. And you're just reporting on what happened. You're just saying, here's what happened. And we ended up in a place that I could not have imagined. And I'm so proud of the way these kids listen to each other. I'm so proud of the way that, we dealt with something that was sticky and that was hard and that was a conflict or just, a very interesting thing that I probably wouldn't have brought up myself. There it is. I'm sure you've been in the classroom and many, many times when there are events that happen out in the world, and it's in your classroom, and making space for that is critical because it's on kids' minds.
Absolutely.
One thing that happens behind the scenes in Adopt a Classroom is the teacher connection. And I think with the teacher leaders being able to see other teachers online, teaching, explaining, thinking, solving problems is super powerful. We're both members of the teacher advisory board, and it's just been such a powerful experience to meet with people all across the country. I don't know how many states we have represented, but many. Felicia's in New York, I'm in California, there are people in Florida, there are people in Minnesota, there are people in Massachusetts, like all over the place from so many different places, and you get to see teachers, the struggles that teachers have, the resources that teachers have, the resources that teachers don't have, and just, live the experience of a teacher through somebody else's eyes, really see what it's like there. And it holds up a mirror, right? It makes you think about, what do I do? What do I have? What can I do? How can I be different?
What a great additional example of storytelling and the power of storytelling, right? And exploring the layers of how we exist, even in this field as educators. So I just really want to tell you both how much I appreciate talking with you and connecting and hearing your stories all the time, but particularly today. And thank you so much for being here with us.
We appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.